Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Joseph. And I'm very aware that my dinner lecture stands between the first course and the soup. So I would be accused of human rights abuses, if I were to go on for too long. So I will not talk about ASEAN for the next 3 hours, which we can do at length. So I'll really try to keep my talk 30 minutes, but if I go on much longer than that, Joseph, I give you the permission to come and tell me to stop, because I do tend to go off on tangent. I'm not giving you a PowerPoint presentation because, if you present 10 pages, then it can be 50 minutes. I've been asked to talk about ASEAN at 50, a force for peace and stability. So many of you are probably already well aware that about ASEAN. Many of you are from ASEAN countries and also ASEAN dialogue partners. And in the past week, there have been really dozens of articles on ASEAN, including from colleagues at RSIS. What Joe forgot to mention is I'm actually his guest at the moment. I'm a visiting professor at RSIS, starting a few days ago. So, and I know that many of you who are sitting here from RSIS have already written about ASEAN. So it's going to be a bit difficult for me to take what angle, that would be refreshing. But firstly, I think it is well recognized that with all of its faults and weaknesses, one of the greatest achievements of ASEAN is the fact that it has been regarded as the main contributor to regional peace and stability. In fact, Ambassador Kishore Mahbubani has written a book about it and repeatedly said that ASEAN should, in fact, be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. They've awarded it to the EU, and after that they had Brexit. So now, while in ASEAN, we are celebrating our 50th anniversary, and we have to recognize the fact that in the past 50 years, at least among the original ASEAN member states, no shots have been fired in anger, except recently between Cambodia and Thailand, a few shots. But that is not a bad record if one compares to what happened in Southeast Asia prior to the establishment of ASEAN. And also if one looks at other parts of the world now, I think that it is well deserved. If ASEAN pats itself on the back, I think we are not being too complacent, but the fact that it is well deserved. So I'd just like to look at, what exactly does ASEAN do? What exactly has it done that it can actually promote peace and stability, and how does it do it? So I would like to look at 4 major areas. Remember that the ASEAN member states are mostly newly independent countries. Except Thailand, all of the other countries have been colonized, and they are mostly developing countries. Singapore is the only one that is now, a developed economy, the fully developed economy, but most of the other ASEAN countries are very much in the process of both nation building and state building. So for the most important role that ASEAN has played, and this is particularly coming from Indonesia, and that's why Indonesia went into ASEAN, joined ASEAN in 1967, co-founded ASEAN with 4 other countries, is the fact that the improvement in relations between neighboring countries have freed the member states so that they can focus into their internal development. So this is very, very important. That is not the case, for example, for the EU, that was maybe less important, although the post-World War reconstruction is also very important, but even more so here. So the most important aspect of ASEAN is it's not really regional integration as such. It's not what ASEAN does substantively. But in the beginning, it didn't really matter that the ASEAN foreign ministers only met a few times, that they didn't have a summit between 1967 and 1976, that there was not much political economic cooperation. Political cooperation was in fact not even mentioned, and obviously military officers were not really allowed to meet because there is concern that ASEAN should not be perceived as a military alliance. There was a concern that there could be a negative reaction from China. But the fact that confrontations between Indonesia and Malaysia were ended, and there were now hotlines between Jakarta and Kuala Lumpur, between Kuala Lumpur and Singapore, between Jakarta and Singapore and so on. This enabled leaders in Jakarta, in Bangkok, in Kuala Lumpur, in Singapore, and in Manila to ignore the urgency of regional relations so that they could focus their attention on internal development. And secondly, it allows them to free scarce resources from having to buy weapons. So if you look at Indonesia, during the Sukarno period, Indonesia was one of the largest buyer of weapons from the Soviet Union. During the New Order period, when Indonesia was under a military government, the defense budget actually went down and went down and down, because most of the scarce resources was directed towards economic development. Because the major threat to security for many of the Southeast Asian countries came from within. In fact, continues to come from within. So this is a very important role that ASEAN played and continues to play a very important role for the member states. So if you look at ASEAN countries, now they have increased their military budget, but it is not an arms race in the traditional sense of competitive arms race because you're worried about threats from your neighboring countries. Usually you'll see increase of arms purchases related to economic growth, economic development. If one neighboring country buys an F-16, another country will buy something else. It's not because they feel threatened, but if they have cash to spare. If they don't have cash to spare, they don't do it. So I think that it's very important that help promote internal development of the neighboring, of the member states. And there's also that it also stopped member states from intervening in each other's internal affairs. We see now what happened in the GCC countries, where a lot of the tensions in that part of the world, because neighboring countries do actively intervene in each other's. And in this part of the world too, coming from Indonesia, I can say, that Indonesia intervene in Malaysia, intervene in Brunei, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, there is concern of neighboring countries intervening in their internal affairs, like the support for regional rebellions in Indonesia, where Malaya at the time and the Philippines were used both by the Americans and by the British to assist regional rebels against Jakarta. So freed from concerns about external interventions and subversions were very important in enhancing internal security. So the development of national resilience, that is the key word that was developed by ASEAN, that national resilience was in fact the primary priority for all of the Southeast Asian states. And secondly, of course, ASEAN has promoted the development of harmonious neighborly relations and eventually regional integration. Now, if we look at ASEAN, it was only established through a very short declaration, the Bangkok Declaration. There is no legal foundations for ASEAN. For a long time, until ASEAN developed a charter at the end of 2007, ASEAN actually had no legal foundation. It did not have any legal standing. It didn't have legal entity. Very, very different from the EU, which is very much based on legal agreements. But in the beginning, harmonious relations were developed, despite the fact that there was only the Bangkok Declaration. Now, one would argue that during this early period, the harmonious relations was in fact very much dependent on the commitment of leaders. So it's not so much that ASEAN itself, as an independent variable, forcing certain rules of behavior amongst member countries, but rather the other way around. ASEAN was a dependent variable, that the commitment of leaders like Suharto, Lee Kuan Yew, Tun Razak, Marcos, and then the Thai government, which changed quite often at the time, they were committed to end the kind of conflict that Southeast Asia had suffered in the early period, so that even though ASEAN itself was not really in a position to enforce certain behavior, the presence of ASEAN was able to restrain bad behavior. This, if you can remember, there was another conflict, another tension between Singapore and Indonesia, when Singapore executed 2 Marines, 4 Indonesian Marines, who were involved in sabotage activities during the confrontation. That happened in the late, I think it was early 70s, yeah? I can imagine a lot of nationalistic backlash in Indonesia, and people argued that Ganyang Singapura, again, carried the confrontation against. But because Suharto was committed to having good regional relations, because he wanted to focus on Indonesia's economic development, because that's where he saw as a primary threat to Indonesia's stability and security. So, was able to ignore it and ensure that ASEAN continued to survive. The same things happened between Malaysia and the Philippines over the Corregidor affair. As you know, the Philippines claim parts of Malaysia, and they created tensions between the 2 countries. And Malaysia also still, also feels that the Sulu Sultanates also, there are links to Malaysia. And during these early periods, if there had not been an ASEAN, it could easily have come into a major open conflict again. But because of the commitment of the leaders, ASEAN was able to survive. But after a while, ASEAN itself developed mechanisms which would ensure good neighborly relations. ASEAN developed regional code of conduct. In 1976, the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation was the most important treaty, and continues to be the most important code of conduct that ASEAN has, which clearly states that threats or use of force would not be allowed, and all conflicts and disputes should be settled peacefully. There is no enforcement mechanism. If member countries decide not to abide by this, there's really nothing that ASEAN can do effectively. But the presence of this code has in fact served a very important role in regulating behavior between ASEAN countries. And one also should argue, of course, that if one were to talk about the weaknesses of ASEAN, ASEAN diffuses conflicts. The presence of the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation enables countries to behave reasonably with each other, but it is a fair weather treaty in a way. It just assumes that everybody would behave well. And it does effectively diffuse conflicts, but ASEAN has never actually been able to resolve conflicts because it has never been tested. What it has allowed ASEAN countries to do is that they could put aside their conflicts and try to resolve it through bilateral means or go to the International Court of Justice. For example, Indonesia and Malaysia has disputes over Sipadan and Ligitan Islands, but because they have developed good relations with each other, both countries are willing to take the case to the International Court of Justice and to leave it there and not to worry, not to bother too much about who will be awarded what. Singapore and Malaysia also does the same thing. Now, if relations are not good, I don't think either countries would be willing to submit this to the International Court of Justice. So ASEAN has effectively diffused conflicts, but as I said, it is not the place that has been tested yet, despite the fact that actually there is a mechanism for conflict resolution within the TAC. But because it has to be based on consensus, it has never really been called upon. So you may argue that maybe this is reflections of lack of trust to ASEAN mechanism, but on the other hand, the ASEAN mechanism has reduced tension. And of course, in its development, as we know, ASEAN is now developing a community. There is multi-sectoral cooperation, which is, of course, increasingly strengthening complex interdependence between ASEAN countries. So eventually, one would argue, I would argue that ASEAN is no longer just a dependent variable, dependent on the goodwills of the leaders, but ASEAN itself has become an independent variable. So even if there is a new leader coming in Indonesia or Singapore or Malaysia, I don't think he or she can with impunity say, you know, let's forget ASEAN, because ASEAN itself has become an entity in its own right. It has become a legal entity, and it has had its own dynamics now, so that it forces a certain behavior among countries. So in that is an important development which contributes, of course, to peace and stability. Now, third, what ASEAN has done is, of course, you know, ASEAN has managed to help integrate the rest of Southeast Asia into the regional association. And it has actually facilitated the resolution of conflicts in Cambodia. ASEAN has never actually carried out conflict resolution among member states, but when Cambodia was still outside of ASEAN, ASEAN was an active player, an active actor in helping to resolve the Cambodian conflicts after the invasion of Vietnam. So in that case, you know, in such a situation, ASEAN has been an effective diplomatic player in that situation. ASEAN, of course, has also played a very important role in engaging Myanmar. Some people argued that the Western countries would say, you know, Myanmar reformed because of the sanctions. ASEAN members said Myanmar reformed because ASEAN was willing to engage with Myanmar through enhanced interaction. I would argue that you need both the good cops and the bad cops. ASEAN was able to persuade Myanmar that it's better to engage with ASEAN so that it can end sanction. And so the threat of sanction was used by ASEAN also to persuade Myanmar. But sanction only would not have worked because Myanmar has isolated itself, you know, by itself. So if you just sanction Myanmar, I don't think it would have been effective. But the symbiotic relationship between sanctions and engagement has been very effective. And eventually, as you know, between 1995 and 1999, all of the 10 Southeast Asian countries, the former enemies, the communist countries, which were regarded as threats by the non-communist ASEAN states, have been integrated into the region. So this has created a wider domain for ASEAN as a force for peace and stability. Now, fourth, and I think this is very, very important, the other area, is ASEAN has contributed to the development of strategic autonomy of Southeast Asia. If you look at the region before the development of ASEAN, you know, different Southeast Asian countries had relations with different colonial or imperial powers. They had strategic linkages with different military alliances, except for Indonesia, which is non-aligned. But Southeast Asian countries could not be regarded as masters of their own neighborhood because decision-makings were not really made in this part of the world. And one of the reasons, at least from the Jakartan perspective, you know, why it is so important to have this regional association is to ensure that South Asian countries are masters of their own sub-regional order. And by having ASEAN, I think that the region is enjoying strategic autonomy. And there have been many, many steps to achieve this. Firstly, there's through the Zone of Peace, Freedom and Neutrality, which was introduced in 1971. And then there is a Southeast Asian nuclear weapon-free zone. So it may be declaratory, but we should not take this declaration for granted. The fact that Southeast Asian countries declared that this part of the world would not develop nuclear weapons, will not host nuclear weapons facilities, you know, will not allow other powers to come and use nuclear weapons here. And I think that this is very, very important also in ensuring the strategic autonomy. And also, of course, Southeast Asian countries have developed, opened the TAC to North ASEAN countries. So ASEAN has developed relations with major powers, which would enable ASEAN to have a say in how the region will be ordered. 5, this is a recent development, particularly since the ASEAN Charter. ASEAN has explicitly stated that it wants to be the driver for wider regional architecture. And in fact, this has happened from the very beginning, since the ASEAN Regional Forum in 1994, East Asia Summit in 2005. So ASEAN is the primary convener of meetings, and in the way it has punched above its weight, because it is able to bring all the great regional powers into the region, and the ASEAN provides a forum. Even for China and Japan, for example, there was a time when there was tension between Tokyo and Beijing because of the visit to the Yasukuni temple of Japanese Prime Minister, and they were not talking to each other, but they had, if you remember, reading the toilet diplomacy in Manila, because both the Chinese president and the Japanese PM went to the men's room at the same time, and a lot of media focus on that. So just providing, you know, the venues for meetings is also been very important. So ASEAN, as I said, you know, has developed this idea of inclusive and open regionalism. So trying to spread its code of conduct to the wider region, and also trying to manage relations between the different powers so that no one power would be hegemonic in the region. In Indonesia, under former Foreign Minister Marty Natalegawa, he talked about dynamic equilibrium. So this is, you know, making sure that no major power, no one power would dominate the others. So looking forward, and this is also, Joseph, I know that just maybe 3 minutes left. ASEAN was never intended as a military alliance, because there is this, Indonesia is non-aligned, so it's not allowed to join military alliance. But there is also concern that if it develops to a military alliance, it would be seen as being more anti-China or whatever. But we know that lately, increasingly, there's closer military cooperation between ASEAN countries, as well as between ASEAN military establishments and the wider region. You have the ASEAN Defense Ministerial meeting and also the ASEAN Defense Ministerial Plus meetings. So, in fact, if we look at the development, once the military cooperation started, it developed much faster than any other sectors. Slowly, you know, in the quiet, they have developed. On the sideline of the Shangri-La Dialogue in 2005, if you remember, the Straits of Malacca and the Straits of Singapore were really bothered a lot by piracy, and there's close cooperations between Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia, development of eye in the sky and coordinated patrols. The functioning word here is coordinated patrols. It's not joint patrols yet. But in response to the recent threat in Marawi, in the Philippines, now there's a development of joint naval patrol between Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. So this is, I think, moving in that direction. So moving forward, I would argue that ASEAN really needs also to pool its assets to become not simply a force for peace and stability in the region, but also a force for peace in the wider international arena. Because many of the ASEAN countries send peacekeeping forces, but they're sending it individually without flying the ASEAN flag. And I think that it would be a good idea, besides having the national flag, also have the ASEAN flag and pool the assets so that it can have more significant impact, for example, in the global arena. And also, we have a lot of experience in dealing with humanitarian disasters as well as natural disasters. And if ASEANs were to pool the resources, I think that this would also contribute to global peace and security. So I am only telling you all the positive things. All the negative things you can read in the papers about, you know, about disunity, lack of disagreement of the South China Sea, Geopolitics, rivalry between Beijing and China and Washington, of course, that continues to be major problems and major challenges for ASEAN. But looking at our experience, I am quite confident that ASEAN will be able to grow stronger in the next 50 years. Thank you.